NTFS permissions refer to the security settings applied to files and folders in an NTFS, New Technology File System, formatted volume on Windows operating systems. NTFS permissions are used to control who can access, modify, and perform other actions on files and directories, providing a granular level of security and management. There are two types of permissions in NTFS: basic permissions and advanced permissions. Basic permissions, also known as standard permissions, can be assigned to users or groups to control the basic actions they can perform on a file or folder. For files, the permissions include read, which allows the user to view the contents of the file; write, which allows the user to modify the content of the file; read and execute, which allows the user to read the file and run it if it's an executable; modify, which allows the user to read, write, and delete the file, as well as modify its contents; and full control, which grants the user all permissions, along with the ability to change permissions and take ownership of the file. For folders, the permissions include read, which allows the user to view contents of the folder and list the files in it; write, which allows the user to add files and subfolders to the folder; read and execute, which allows the user to view the contents of the folder and execute programs within it; modify, which allows the user to read, write, modify, and delete files and subfolders within the folder; and full control, which grants the user complete access to the folder, including the ability to modify permissions and take ownership. Advanced permissions give more granular control and can be configured to refine the standard permissions. These permissions allow more specific control over what users can and cannot do with a file or folder. Advanced permissions options include traverse folder, execute file, which allows or denies the ability to access folders and files in a path without necessarily having permissions on the parent folder itself; list folder, read data, which grants permission to list the contents of a folder or read the contents of a file; read attributes, which allows or denies access to the basic properties of the file or folder; read extended attributes, which allows or denies access to additional metadata about a file or folder; create files; write data, which allows the user to create files within the folder or write data to a file; create folders; append data, which allows the user to create subfolders within a folder or append data to the file; delete subfolders and files, which grants or denies permission to delete subfolders and files within a folder; delete, which allows or denies the ability to delete the file or folder; change permissions, which allows or denies the ability to modify permissions on the file or folder; and take ownership, which allows or denies the ability to take ownership of a file or folder. These permissions provide administrators with flexibility to specify exactly what users can do with a file or folder at a very detailed level. NTFS permissions can be inherited from a parent folder. This means that if you assign permissions to a parent folder, those permissions will automatically apply to all files and subfolders within it. By default, child objects inherit the permissions of their parent folder. You can prevent inheritance by disabling the Allow Inheritable Permissions from Parent to propagate to this object option. However, this can be more complex to manage, and it may require you to set permissions manually on individual files or folders. You can explicitly assign permissions to individual files and folders to override the inherited settings, and in this case, the new settings will be applied directly to the object. Effective permissions refer to the actual permissions a user has on a file or folder after combining all explicit permissions, inherited permissions, and group memberships. These permissions may differ from the individual permissions assigned to a user or group due to inheritance or explicit overrides. You can use the Effective Permissions tool to view exactly what access a user or group has on a particular file or folder. This is useful for troubleshooting when a user is having trouble accessing a resource. NTFS permissions can propagate through directories and subdirectories, allowing for efficient management of permissions across a network. If you assign permissions on a folder, these permissions are propagated down to all files and subfolders within that folder unless explicitly overridden. Subfolders inherit permissions from their parent folder unless you break the inheritance chain and assign permissions directly to the subfolder. If you block inheritance on a folder, it will no longer inherit permissions from its parent, but it will still retain its current permissions until you explicitly change them. In an NTFS environment, you typically assign permissions to users or groups. Users are specific individuals who have accounts on the system, while groups are a collection of users who share common permissions. Assigning permissions to groups is a more efficient method of managing access, as users in the group will automatically inherit the permissions associated with the group. It's considered a best practice to assign NTFS permissions to groups rather than individual users. This way, you can easily manage access for multiple users by simply adding or removing them from the group. For example, in a scenario where you want users to be able to view but not modify files in a folder, you would set folder permissions to give read and list folder contents permissions on the folder and read permissions on files. In another scenario, if you want a specific user to have full control over a folder and its contents, you would set folder permissions to give full control to the user or admin group. Lastly, if you want users to be able to modify files but not delete them, you would set folder permissions to give modify or write permissions but deny delete permission. In conclusion, NTFS permissions are a powerful tool in Windows for securing access to files and folders. By using basic and advanced permissions, you can grant, restrict, and manage user access at a detailed level. Understanding how to combine and apply these permissions, whether they are inherited or explicitly set, helps ensure that your system remains secure while allowing authorized users the necessary access.